This week's theme of manuscript culture links in a lot with what the lucky ducks signed up for EH362 Medieval History in fall 2020 are going to be doing. FYI, that class is being moved to 109 because of the hands-on activities we're going to be doing, and that means there's not many spots left. So if you're kind of, I don't know what classes I want to take in fall, we're going to do an awful lot of hands-on stuff with manuscripts in EH362. So part of it ties in well with that class, but also it's a good, I left it to the end of material culture because I knew it was going to tie in with what I'm teaching next semester, but also because there is an inherent materiality to books and bookmaking in the Middle Ages. They're handmade. They are in and of themselves material culture. Even if we're not literary people who study the writing and the contents, the actual physicality of the books is of great interest to us, as well as a social context. Now, books were made differently to today in the Middle Ages. First off, the material that they wrote on, that was parchment. The technical term is vellum. Vellum was made from animal skins. Some of them are goat skins, calf skins, sheep skins. The highest quality were for the highest quality books. It isn't like you're writing on leather. I mean, they do, if you ever get the chance to look at any, we would have if we were meeting face to face, they are very thin and fine. The good quality ones, they're very like paper. You wouldn't believe that they're made out of animal skins. But for cheaper books, they're rougher. You can see the pores on the animal skin. There might be holes in it. These are also handwritten. So this illustration on the right is handwritten, but they went through a lot of training to be able to write in such a neat, legible way. So manuscript, it is a technical term meaning something that is being handwritten. Illuminated is the technical term meaning illustration. So it might be illuminated in that there's pictures or artworks interspersed, or in the case of this one on the right, this is an illuminated initial up on the top left. That is an S for supplicationem. Now, so these earlier medieval books, to begin with, they were made by highly trained scribes who tended to reside in monasteries. In the monasteries, there was a special writing area called the scriptorium, or if it was a big monastery and they produced a lot of books, it's the plural, scriptoria. So in the early Middle Ages, this is how most books were produced at that time. So if I was in class now, I'd ask you, so what kind of books do you expect them to be? And the answer would be overwhelmingly religious in terms of their topic. The most common books to be made in this way were Gospels and liturgical books. Liturgical books meaning books that are used in performing religious services. But then they also had an educational purpose. So a lot of books would have been, for example, grammars. Books that were used in teaching and training new scribes. Over time, bookmaking becomes a more secular pursuit. It's a very urban pursuit. So while we are used to talking about in urban areas there being guilds of stonemasons and carpenters and merchants, there would have also have been professional bookmakers in amongst them by the time we hit the high and definitely the later Middle Ages. There's a whole range of terms used to describe these books, these manuscripts. For example, we don't call them pages, we call them folios instead. So you're going to see reference today in videos to folios, and that's what it means. So they, how they looked really varied based on the time period they were produced. It's a way for us to date based on the handwriting. A lot of the works produced were religious in nature, though not exclusively, and that's what I'm going to come back to. So Gospels, the works of the Church Fathers, the grammars. They wanted books that were going to be easy to read, nice and neat. So there's different forms of handwriting for different time periods. The one here on the right is a form of writing called Caroline minuscule. As you can see, it's very curved, it's very neat, sort of universal in height. The Caroline comes from Carolingians. This is how the Carolingian court wrote their documents. So we know if we see a document looks like this, we get a rough idea of the date. But if we go forward in time, we get different trends in writing and in illuminations, just like in other forms of art. So in the 11th century, a more angular form called Gothic took over. And then in the 15th century, there was a return more to the curves and neatness of the Carolingian forms. Now, on the right here, is an image from a book that we actually did get to see in class before we all had to go to remote learning. This is the Luttrell Psalter. This is the book that you saw because we have a facsimile copy of it in the archives. So the Luttrell Psalter is a very stereotypical Gothic style manuscript. In terms of the handwriting that they're used. It's very thin, it's very pointy. The types of books that were produced by this period, so we're entering later in the Middle Ages, with these types of writing varied. Increasingly, it's not just for use by churchmen, produced by and for churchmen, but produced for the increasingly literate populations of Europe. Now, in saying this, even though ordinary people not in the church are increasingly literate, they still want to buy religious books. So, for example, a type of book we're going to come to later in class is called a Book of Hours. And this was a very, very popular book for noble people to buy in France. The wealthy literate would have had a Book of Hours that allowed them to practice their religion independently. In England, the psalters, of which the Luttrell Psalter is but one example, were much more popular. But for the same reason, nobility, wealthy people, have disposable income and want to spend it on religious materials. So we're going to look at we're not looking at the Psalter again because we got to see that in class, but we'll see a Book of Hours in a video later, which you would have seen if we were still on campus. But anyway, video is better than nothing. All of this changes around the year 1455. Everything before 1455 is going to be handwritten. It's going to be that technical term, a manuscript. There is no printed book until after 1455. Even after 1455, written documents are produced. It's just that the role of printing increases after 1455. The very first printed book was the Gutenberg Bible in 1455, and this came out of the workshop of Johannes Gutenberg in Germany. Gutenberg had perfected a technique called the movable type printing press. This means that he put the type onto sticks, each individual letter on its own, and then effectively stamped it so that he could make multiple copies of the same page, and then he would stitch it together. So obviously this means that they're less pretty because you're not going to get the illustrations like you might hear with the Luttrell Psalter. A lot simpler, but you could produce a lot more in a lot less time. This could never have happened though if it wasn't for another invention, and that is of paper. As I mentioned to you before, in the Middle Ages, most of the manuscripts were made out of vellum, that's animal skin. Paper, which was originally at this time made out of fabrics, torn up fabrics, was a technology that arrived in the 15th century in Europe too. And it was a lot quicker and a lot cheaper than producing vellum. So these two, both the movable type printing press and paper, made a big impact in terms of the numbers of books themselves being produced. We call the period from roughly 1450 to 1500, books from that period, we call them incunables. And it's from the Latin to mean from the cradle. So it means from the cradle of printing. They're baby books, if you wish. So in this roughly 50-year period, about 20 million of these incunables were produced in printing houses across Europe. And as you can see from this map, while there were not, there was only one originally, it became a pretty common thing to have in major urban areas within that 50-year period. So really there's two major producers of documentary materials, and that is number one, religion, which I've kind of just explained and we'll come back to, and number two, government, which we're going to move on to now. So the first type of government area that's going to need to produce a lot of documents is going to be the legal profession. In the Middle Ages, the civil law courts, and remember there's two types of law in the Middle Ages. There's the church law, which we call canon law, which is C-A-N-O-N, not two N's. Canon goes boom. So you don't fire the kind of canons with one N because they're a priest. And then also the civil law courts, which is, yeah, the ordinary law courts that we've got today. Increasingly over the Middle Ages, the civil law courts were based on revisiting the laws of ancient Rome. Specifically, they went and looked at a civil body of law called the Corpus Juris Civilis. This was rediscovered by Europeans around the end of the 11th century, and it was how lawyers were taught law at the universities across Europe. So this Corpus Juris Civilis was around in the early Middle Ages, but it wasn't revived in the High Middle Ages, to the point where it became the most common law across Europe by the later Middle Ages. So the Corpus Juris Civilis, which translates as the body of civil law, is as I said, older. It's the modern name for this fundamental collection of laws, and these were issued in the 6th century between 529 and 535 by order of Justinian I, who was the Eastern Roman Emperor. So therefore, it's sometimes also referred to as the Code of Justinian. Now, Justinian went and had it reissued, recodified as a way to make a power statement, because he saw himself as following on the tradition from ancient Rome. So from an Eastern perspective, if we're Byzantinists, there's no break in terms of the legal system. But in the West, which we have been predominantly interested in, the application of Roman law is a feature of the High Middle Ages. The one possible exception to this is England. England had its own system of law called common law, that it had been around for even centuries before the Anglo-Normans invaded in 1066. Before the Normans, the Anglo-Saxons practiced it, so it had been around for a long time. And common law means that it's common to the whole country. They already had established circuits of shire courts, so that's courts at the county level, meaning that the law in England was centralised and it was standard as well. So there's lots and lots of different types of court within the legal system, and they're obviously all going to produce their own documents. The lowest courts of law were the manorial courts, so the courts that were attached to the manors that we spent a good amount of this semester talking about. They probably met in the hall, in the manor house or in the castle. And in these manor courts, they dealt with matters over which the lord of the manor had jurisdiction. So that's things like local contracts, land tenure, householdings, the power of the lord who acted as the judge. His power is limited to those who lived within the bounds of his manor. To his domain, that is his private area, and other lands that the lord had given us as fiefs to his vassals. So it's tied specifically to the manor. There's within the manorial system also the court of honor, and this was for the manor's chief tenants. The court baron were for not chief tenants but free tenants, so kind of the next step down. The court customary was for the unfree tenants, that is the serfs, the villeins. So even within the manorial court that would have been held at every major medieval manor, there's different types of court based on your social hierarchy. The court leet was a court of record. Its duty was to review pledges that were made between people. They reviewed the oaths of peacekeeping. They made sure that there was good practice in trade. But interesting for the future of law, and if you're a legal historian, they actually would conduct trials with juries and punish based on jury recommendations. And this applied to all of the crimes committed within their jurisdiction. If you did an even more serious crime, you were then committed to the king's justices. Despite there being a jury here, it was not what we would today call trial by jury. The jury instead indicted wrongdoers, the jury stood witness, and the jury helped decide on punishment, but did not go so far as we have today, where they make the decisions. And this is because the court-lead system was developing while the jury system was also developing. But obviously, as we know, in time it changed. That's the rule for England. In France, I mean, these law courts are pretty similar versions across different parts of Europe, but different names, obviously. Like in France, they had open courts, and these were led by special inspectors called enquêteurs. And they were traveling legal inspectors. They would travel around France and hold open courts, and they would hear all sorts of grievances along the way. But obviously France, big country, and as we know, was growing in terms of its territory. So this meant that the enquêteur system was pretty outdated, you know, suited maybe an earlier medieval period, but in a increasingly centralized monarchy in a large country, it's not going to work. So they had to create a permanent site for a royal court. And this was founded in Paris, where professional jurists and professional legal folk handled all the cases. This became known as the Parlement. So these courts produce documents. I have a picture here on the left, which is not actually a legal record. I mean, there still are the court records. You can still find copies of those and research them. But what I've got here on the left, that is actually I don't think it's the one that we've got in the library. The one in the library we've got looks very similar. It's actually a copy of a couple of folios from the Corpus Juris Civilis. So you can see the double columns that are slightly darker with the blue in the middle. That's the text of the law itself. All the stuff that's written around them is commentary on what the key points are. So when we quite often see layout like this in medieval documents, and it's usually to tell us that it's a commentary on something more specific. That's the way they like to lay it out. It made sense to them reading and working with it, because a lot of these were working documents. So that's how the law courts work. They produced material culture in terms of the records, but also in the development of the law. But there were many other ways governments produced material culture. For example, we have got the English Chancery documents. The English Chancery was the royal writing office, the royal secretary. Again, this was an early medieval system that England had, that when the Normans invaded, they were like, well, this is handy, and developed it even further. The reason it had a lot of powers because of this thing on the bottom left, the big red bit. That is the Great Seal of England. This was the most solemn of the royal seals, and the existence of seals was to authenticate the different documents on behalf of the king that applied to the whole kingdom. So the point being that you might forge a piece of paper for the king telling you to do, you know, whatever. But unless it had his seal attached, of which there's only like a copy of it, you couldn't prove that it was real. You would say it's a forgery. So it was a way to prevent, or at least reduce, forgeries, or at least, you know, if you faked a great seal, you were in so much trouble. You definitely would have been executed for that. So it was a system of authentication. The way that they used to do it in England is unlike the rest of Europe. You hear these documents look quite flat. What they used to do in England was enroll the documents. I've got a picture of that to show you shortly. And this began during the reign of John at the very end of the 12th century, very beginning of the 13th century, where they would arrange each of the documents by regnal year. And regnal year is not like our, you know, 1st of January to 31st of December year. A regnal year is from the date of the king's coronation and then the year past. So, you know, say a king was crowned on the 27th of April. That would be day 1 of the regnal year. the 28th of April is day 2 of the regnal year, and so on and so forth until you get to the end of the regnal year. So they would organise them along regnal years, because the king. And these would contain a whole load of different stuff, mostly written in Latin, and they would keep all the things that were issued in the king's name together. So on the left here is what we call a letters patent. And letter patent mean that it was a letter open, an open letter. That's what the patent mean. So you can see at the bottom, it's not like actually the Great Seal, it's a wax imprint of the Great Seal, big blob of wax, and stamp it in. And they attached it to the letter with a special parchment tag. And this was to prevent forgery, give authenticity, prove that the king had indeed issued it. They tend to be very formulaic. If I could zoom in a little bit, the first couple of lines of this document would be very, very samey, very formulaic. They usually start off with, "To all whom may it concern, know that I, king so-and-so of," and then all the places. They're very formulaic. On the right, though, this is another type of letter issued by this chancery, and this was the letters close, which does as it says on the tin. It's literally closed. It's a private letter. It would have been folded. It then would have been sealed shut with a wax seal imprint, and the seal had to be broken for the contents to be read. So that would guarantee that it hadn't been tampered with, because you'd need to have the king's seal to reattach another one, so a way to keep it secure. So unlike the letters patent, which are open, the letters close, they're closed. They're destined for an individual or a single corporate body like a guild of merchants or a monastic house. So these these then would be called together en masse, the patent rolls and the close rolls, because when they would send one off, but they would keep themselves a copy to make sure that they remembered what they did, things get lost, whatever. So the recipient would get a copy, the government would keep a copy, and then, as I said, they organize them according to regnal year, and then they would actually just roll them up to store them, which is unlike everywhere else in Europe, who put them into great big books and stack them. Makes it interesting to read them nowadays. You have to unroll them. It's quite complicated. So that was the one of the government bodies producing vast amounts of documents and material things on behalf of the king. But there's also, that's the legal system, there's also the exchequer. And the exchequer was the economic side of running a country. So the exchequer had the responsibility for all the government accounts, including tax collection and debt collection. The key people here were the sheriffs, which is a term I know you've heard even for Robin Hood. This is why there was a sheriff of Nottingham. The sheriffs reported to the exchequer. It met without the king. In fact, the very first recorded meeting of the exchequer in England had the Queen in attendance to oversee the finances. The exchequer is named after what I've put in this picture on the slide, the chequer table. This chequer table is actually being used to perform calculations for taxes and goods. It's a really big table. It's 10 feet by 5 feet, and it's got a raised edge or lip on all sides, about the height of palm's height, to ensure that nothing could roll off it. And what they would do is place counters on the chequer table to represent various values. So probably something, maybe it's not a game in Vegas actually, you know, be the Royal Exchequer. So the exchequer part refers to the appearance of the table that they use to do their complicated mathematical questions. It actually comes from the French. The French is échiquier. It's actually a black cloth with green stripes, and each stripe is about a hand's width, and as you can see, it's in a checker pattern. The different spaces have different attributes, so some of them represent pounds, some of them represent shillings, some of them represent pence. In the case of England, again, it seems to have been an early medieval practice that they went, hey, this is sensible, we're going to keep on doing this. And then actually it spread from England. They did it in Normandy and in France too. This gives the king a lot of power, even though he actually doesn't pitch up for their meetings very often. It gives him power because he could reward somebody by making sure he paid them promptly, or he could reward them by being like, hey, I know you owe me money, but I like you. I'm going to give you a bit more time to pay up. Or he could use it as a threat, such as, well, the exchequer says you owe me a lot of money, so pay it right now, or I'm going to take your castle. It also was a great example of that old saying, knowledge is power. That the English king had the exchequer, which meant he knew all of his income. He knew exactly how much he had in the kitty to spend. Knowledge is power. In France, they did not do it this way. Well, the King of France. In parts of France, they followed the English system, but the King of France didn't. The royal finances in France were under control of the religious order, military order known as the Knights Templar, who are better known as originating out during the Crusades. But the French kings handed over responsibility to finances to the Templars, and they were set up in Paris to do the annual audit of French accounts. But this was very great to begin with, but by around the year 1300, France has conquered a lot of territory back. It's getting pretty difficult for just one group of guys to do all the finances for France. And because they made mistakes and they were very inefficient, it led to a lot of accusations that the Templars were stealing money from the King of France. And ultimately, King Philip of France suppressed them, executed them for cheating him of money. Instead, in 1302, Philip created the Estates General. And this was a representative assembly to approve his policies and raise him taxes for use in war. So unlike in England, where there'd always been this parliament and the king worked with it because he knew it was an advantage to them, in France, the parliamentary tradition emerged as a way to shore up the king, not as a way to curtail him. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the material culture to do with the exchequer. And this little picture here is of a tally stick. And if we were in class, I would show you a tally stick that a student made in class, and we might give it a go as long as nobody chopped a finger off. But this was how there's, if you look at Google the National Archives of the UK and look for images, they've got like thousands of these little tally sticks all saved up, and they are exactly what you see. They're little wooden sticks and little notches are cut in them. They're called talea in Latin, and this indicates a sum that's owed to the exchequer by the sheriffs and other officials of how much money and taxes they should be owing to the crown. The details are written down each side. Okay, so for this example, which is a later one, because it's easier to read, it says due on demand, and it says FBOCD, £5, 6 shillings and 3 pence. So you would write on it, and that actually also copies the notches there. So the £5 is the long, deep one, and then you've got the 3 V-shaped cuts. That is the 6 pence. And then the 6 shillings are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines cut in. So what they would do is make the stick, write on it, make the talea, and then they would split it into 2. The debtor would keep the larger point, which is called the foil, and the exchequer would keep the smaller one, which was known as the counterfoil or the stock. They were usually made out of easily accessible softwood, such as hazel or boxwood, so that they could be malleable and cut into pretty easily. They were usually inscribed with iron gall ink. Even after parchment and paper became a more convenient means for recording such information, tally sticks remained in use because they were so durable, being made out of wood. They were also very secure. You've got to put the two of them together to get the whole. It's very difficult to falsify the unique patterns created on a tally stick. It probably actually is very early in terms of its origin. It's likely very early medieval, long predating the exchequer. The other thing about picking certain types of wood over each other is they would pick woods that had distinctive grain patterns, such as willow. So that would mean that not only would the notches and the writing match, they would also look to see whether the wood grains would match up with one another. So really, really hard to fake. If you had a tally stock, also kind of operated as currency. Say you had a tally stock showing that Bishop Bassett owed you £5, and if you were worried that he maybe wasn't so good for that money, the tally stock itself was worth close to £5 in its own right. It kind of is becoming a little bit like the way we use banknotes today, with it representing some, the buyer promises to produce on demand. So if you wanted to buy something, you might find that a seller would be pleased to accept a tally stick as payment, as safe and convenient form of payment. So the tally sticks themselves became a kind of money, a peculiar sort of debt that could be traded really quite freely. Tally sticks we know circulated from person to person until, nobody really had any connection with this theoretical Bishop Barrett that I've just mentioned. Now, another secure form of document, and a lot of these, or bits of them, survive, are called chirographs. They're also known as indentures. And these are medieval documents, and on these they write duplicate, triplicate, or even sometimes quadruplicate, that's 4 copies, of the same thing. Excuse me. On the left here, there are actually 3 copies of exactly the same document. What they would do, and then you can see the wiggly lines, is they would write the Latin word chirographum across the middle, and then they would cut along the wiggly lines you can see there to separate the 3 parts. A chirograph is also a term that refers to a papal law whose circulation is limited to the papal court. Now, the indentation, from where indenture gets its term, is what we see more on the right there. And the intention of this form of document making is that you produce 2 or more identical written copies of a legal agreement. Each party in the transaction would keep a copy, and this would then allow them to verify at a later date the agreement they made by comparing them with one another. The cut, as you can see, I've got the examples of the 2 most common cuts here, a wavy line or a serrated line, and they usually ran through the words chirographum, and that way they would match up the copies physically, and the reason for this was to prevent forgery. And the fact this also led to them being nicknamed indentured. So we have a lot of these surviving, maybe not all 3 of them, but you have a surprising amount of one of them surviving because somebody has obviously taken good care of it. Now, as I mentioned, in England, when they reached the end of their regnal year, they would then sew everything together and roll it up into a roll. This picture here is the pipe roll for 1213 to 1214 from the National Archives in Kew in England. So what is in this is the pipe roll, is the English Exchequer's audit of the accounts that the sheriffs reported to them. So they would make a copy of what the sheriffs were giving them. Sheriff of Nottingham, say, has given us £10, we're going to make a note of that. They would record it on a big long roll of parchment, and then they would roll it up and put it into storage, and it's called pipe because it looks like a pipe when it's all rolled up. So the pipe rolls, they supply details of payments made to the crown, also from the crown, also records any debts that are still owed. So part of what is shown here in the picture that I chose, this is a pipe roll entry for the county of Cornwall in the southwest of England. It was compiled in 1214 at Michaelmas, because when they used dates in the Middle Ages, they used a lot of religious holidays. And this is what we call a membrane, the piece we're looking at. It's a folio on a book, but it's a membrane if it's a roll. It's subdivided by headings such as De Placitas Forestae, which means forest payments. So that's what part of this document is concerning, how much the king got from his forests. And then another part of this is called De Scutagio Pictavi, which is the scutage for Poitou. Poitou is one of the king's lands in France, and scutage was the money you paid instead of providing your own knight service. So these are the kind, I picked these as examples of the kind of things that the king wanted to keep track of. This means that the English Exchequer has a memory, and you couldn't really hoodwink them. You couldn't be like, no, 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 I paid that, because they could go and pull out this pipe roll at any particular time and call you on it. So this actually becomes very, and it's a nice point for us to stop this class with the power of the materiality of the written word, because these different, I've talked mainly about England because he's the most powerful in terms of his legal rights in the whole of Europe, but I've mentioned France as well. And what it means is that with all of this documentary producing, it increases the king's power because he has a well-documented bureaucracy there to support him. These patterns that I've just explained to you are taken on throughout after the Middle Ages, through the early modern period, by rulers right across Europe. It becomes part of the trend towards the absolutism of the early Middle Ages, that the king needs to know exactly what's going on within his kingdom. So these are quite important if we were interested in the history of documents. These are important ones to look at. A lot of documents those were the most common secular ones, but a lot of them are religious though. And actually we're going to have a look at religious archives by looking at, at religious documents by looking at what our own archives here at CMO have that can tell us about the materiality of book production to do with religious things. So what's going to come up next after this video is there's going to be a link to the LibGuide from the archives, and you can read and look at some pictures of the religious books that we actually have in the archives. And I really hate to tell you this, but had you been there face to face still the semester, we would have gone and looked at them in person, but we'll have to make do with videos. So have a look at the LibGuide, and then I put link 2 YouTube videos which are going to show you more of these books. Then you're going to have a question about it. Now those videos and the LibGuide are talking mainly about religious books, and I want you to think about the materiality of them. And the difference between these books and the newer acquisitions made by Kent Library, which are folios, that term again. These are actually fragments in that they're part of, had been part of a bigger book, and they've been pulled apart, and sometimes been pulled apart, but more often than not, they were used because, leather, they're not leather, they're vellum. But it's a good sturdy material. So if you think about when you get a book for school and you want to take good care of it, you back it in strong paper to protect the spine and protect the edges. And early modern people did this too, only they used what they thought were worthless religious manuscripts from the Middle Ages. So today these survive in what we call fragments. And we've got quite a lot of these now in the university's new medieval teaching collection. We've already got fall 2018. I don't think there might be somebody in this class, I think, who took that class. We worked with the new fragments that we acquired in 2018, and the students researched their historical context, made a beautiful display that's up in the library next to the periodicals desk. But actually in EH362 next semester, we're going to be working with the documents that the Crusades and Culture Contact class, EH480, picked this semester. So we're going to have brand new fragments to work and play with, and you guys will be the first ones. So not even a shameless plug. Come and take it, and you will get to handle a lot of really cool medieval stuff. You can actually even read a little bit about it in another link that I've posted, and this is a Southeast Missourian newspaper article about what we're doing in class. And by the way, I know the Southeast Missourian only lets you have a certain number of free clicks every week, so if you click on it and it's like, no, you've used all your clicks and you can't get at it, don't worry, it's interesting, but it's not compulsory. But, okay, as well as seeing the cool stuff, shameless plug for what we're going to be doing next semester, also we're talking about having you make your own illuminated manuscripts. And that is what the next couple of links are about. because this class is material culture and it's going to seek into EH362 medieval history next fall pretty nicely in terms of the material culture of manuscripts. How were these items made? Not just why were they made, but how were they made? So I've got a link from the British Library, how to make a medieval manuscript, and then you want to give it a go, we will in next semester, but even if you're not, if you're graduating or what have you, I've put a link to as well called how to make a medieval manuscript. So if you're super bored during COVID-19, you can follow the ingredients posted on the British Library and make your own medieval manuscript. I'm not telling you have to do this. It's definitely not an extra credit. It's just if you're bored. After that, it's time to go to the Flipgrid. For our last Flipgrid, because this is our last week. It's so sad. And this week should be so cool and hands-on instead of doing it remotely. But anyway, come take 362. We'll do lots of touching and mixing and making gross things. It's going to be excellent. Come take EH362, unless you're graduating. In which case, well done you. And I hope to see you again.